So let's do a review of Ecclesiastes so far. We start with, it's a book of what? We call it a wisdom book. It's written by Solomon, a man of great wisdom and discernment, greater than any other man. So that's the foundation. And I think this is important for us to repeat that every single time, because in knowing that is sometimes how we get answers later on, like we will get into today. The book of Ecclesiastes was Solomon's theory on the meaning of life. And his thesis is the meaning of life can't be found in this creation, and it is vanity for us to try to seek that in this creation. Because all things are from God, then man is to be content in every situation. Then we went on to chapter 7. What do you, or would you say, was your review of the meaningful things that we covered at the beginning of chapter 7? Okay. He did say that what we do in our lives does matter. It's not like it doesn't. So it doesn't matter in terms of changing God's mind, and we're to live content, but he says it matters. So when confronted with pain, we must embrace it for what? For what it does for us. Not to reject it, not to put it out there as a challenge that God didn't know what he was doing, or that, am I being punished? Am I being disciplined? Am I being trained? Is it done irregardless of anything that I did do? Right? Just sometimes things come on. I mean, that's what the whole book of Job is about. Things coming on when you can't explain it. So we don't know. We do know bad things happen, and we do know sometimes God's disciplining, sometimes God's punishing, sometimes God's just bringing the dross to the top to make you a different person. So you can't associate the outcome, the pain part of it, with what God was thinking when God allowed it. That's what Solomon's saying over and over. Based on what you see on the outside and your measurement of good or bad is not what you get to go back and say that that was God's meaning when he allowed this to happen. You don't know the mind of God. That's his whole point. And that's where we were going. But we do know everything comes from his hand. What we endure during this life is not a reward or punishment or an indication of our stance before God in eternity. And that, ladies, was the key. If there's another key in this book, that was big for me. The end of what we finished in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 last week. Because Solomon tells us why God doesn't respond to mankind in this checklist way. In other words, God doesn't say, you're my child in eternity. And I'm going to make sure that everybody else here knows that, because I'm going to make sure you are wealthy and wise and no pain and everything's great. That's how I'm going to demonstrate to all these people who you are. Conversely, if you're not the one and I'm going to make sure that bad, evil, painful things happen so everybody else out here understands how I see you in eternity. And Solomon gave us at the end of those two verses, that's not how God works. He purposely says, for you, I might do good here, but I might not. So what happens to you here is not a determination of who you are before him in eternity. That was the whole reason that God does this. He mixes it all up so that we don't have that clue. Only God knows. If we can accept that, does that help us then embrace when things don't go the right way in our life? We should always start with, well, what could it be? Is it punishment? Is it discipline? Is it? But if there's really nothing I can find, I can still embrace it and say, God has a reason, and I'm to be content. And it's easy to be content, as Solomon said, in the day of prosperity. It's not so happy to be content in the day of adversity. That's our human nature. It's not unique to, in America we experience that. No, that's a human experience across cultures. It's across time. Because you could talk to somebody 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, they would have the same mentality. That's a human nature. That's common in human nature. So, with our understanding of how Solomon spoke to us and gave us an explanation in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 7, this was Solomon's ultimate frustration. He understood it. He put it out there for us, but this was still his ultimate frustration with God, that God doesn't display here and give away anything that he's thinking about later. And we're going to see that as we continue with these easy verses of Ecclesiastes in chapter 7. Okay, for those of you who've read ahead, I think you know what I'm talking about. We're going to do verses 15 through 18 to begin with. I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. Do not be excessively righteous, and do not be overly wise. Why should you ruin yourself? Do not be excessively wicked, and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp one thing and also not let go of the other. For the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. Yeah, that's what I did. I went, what? I had to laugh. All right, so in verse 15, remembering that Solomon is continuing from the conclusion he just gave us in 13 and 14, which is you don't figure out God and how things are seen on earth. What does he say? In verse 15, how does he begin? I've seen everything during my lifetime of futility. So when Solomon says, I have seen, what have we learned that means? It's his experience. He's a witness to it. When he's a witness to things, in this case, he tells us when did he witness these things? During my lifetime. So he tells us it's actually the time he's lived. He's seen it himself. And then he describes his lifetime as what? Futility. Okay, is this a man at the end of his life and in some ways at the end of his wits to try to figure things out? That's what he's telling us. So you understand the heart of this man who's trying to figure things out. What everything is Solomon referring to? When he says, I've seen everything. What would you do if you're trying to figure out that word in another book? If you read a sentence in another book that said, oh, and everything. When you try to go back and see what that author had been talking about previous, so you get an idea of what everything was, well, what did he just tell us about in verses 13 and 14? He said that God has made both the day of prosperity as well as the day of adversity. And what was God's purpose? This was the end of verse 14. So that man will not discover anything that will be after him. We don't get the clue. That's what he's talking about. That's the everything he just described for us. So what happens to a man in this life is not a predictor of what God has prepared for him in eternity. That's the everything. He can't figure this out. In verse 15, Solomon says he's seen everything. What specific example does Solomon begin to describe for us? There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness. All right, so the first man described by Solomon is a righteous man. What is a righteous man? Let's not go with God's determination of righteousness yet. We're going to go there. But when the term just gets used, a righteous man, I mean, you know, unbelievers can use that term as well. What do they mean by righteous? A good man, you know, some moral standards that they live up to, right? They've got some, we can see there's some good things that they do. And maybe they do more good than they do bad, or whatever measurement we start to go down. In this case, what happens to this righteous man? He perishes. The better way to understand this phrase would be that this righteous man perishes because he's righteous. So this righteous man stood up and did something that others would see as righteous, And in some way, he perished for that. Maybe he stood up for a friend that was being treated wrong, right? You can fill in the blanks. This confuses people. Why should the righteous, especially when they're in the midst of doing righteousness, perish for it? That doesn't make any sense at its ultimate level. The righteous doing righteous should be at least protected while they're doing righteous. Maybe the next day when they were doing something unrighteous, that's when God can go ahead and get them. But not when they're in the middle of doing something righteous. Right? That just blows our minds. That's not how it should work in our minds. So the righteous man was not protected from perishing because that he was righteous or doing righteous. In worldly view, this would be like we see the movies, right? The guy in the white hat always wins, right? If he's wearing the white hat, you know he's going to be there at the end of the show. The guy in the black hat, not so much, right? That's a silly way of saying, but that was put in the movies for a reason, right? Because we wanted to know, well, that's the good guy. He's going to be around at the end, and the guy with the black hat, he's the bad guy. Bad things are going to happen. And when it's done, isn't there a sense of satisfaction when we see the end of the movie and the good guy got the good thing? How successful are movies when the bad guy wins and the guy in the white hat loses? They're not box office hits for a reason. It violates everything within us to know that or to accept that. And yet we see it. We don't understand it. And we really like it when we watch the shows where the good guy wins. That's what's inside of us. It's part of our human nature. Whether we're saved or not, that is part of human nature. Good people should get good things. All right, so this is not true in what we see in our time. And Solomon says he had witnessed this during his entire lifetime. So he has seen this over and over and over, and it doesn't make sense to him. And remember, he's so smart. He thinks he should be able to figure it out. And that's why he's spinning out here at the end of his life. Verse 15, how does that verse end? So now we got a wicked man who prolongs his life in wickedness. Okay. Who's a wicked man? So they would be, we'd say, the obvious ones, right? Morally corrupt, out to do nothing but harm to others, right? We can use the extremes to understand what he's talking about. What does this wicked man do? Prolongs his life in wickedness. Okay. What does prolong mean? He lives longer, right? Sometimes it can be a line that goes out, like if you do math and you have a prolonged, right? It was only this long, but then it prolongs and goes out longer and longer, okay? This man with the longer life, okay, it's not that he made it longer, but he had a longer life in his wickedness. That's the question. Right? Does this make sense? So the man with the longer life is living, and yet Solomon says we can look back and see, but we know he was wicked. Does that bring questions to your mind? That doesn't seem right. It seems like if you're wicked, your life should be shorter. Why should you be allowed to live longer and do all of the wicked? That's the same question that Solomon has. This is something that is true in our own experiences, right? We don't have to be in Solomon's shoes to experience this. We've all seen this. There are many wicked people who continue to live in their wickedness in what appears to be no restraint. No godly restraint. No righteous man restraint. Okay, so we're just going to have a little sharing moment here, ladies. There's been plenty of times that I have watched somebody say something on TV, and I think, oh, that's a lightning bolt moment. God should be ka-choom, shutting that up and making that go away, because that's just wrong. Because if it were me, I had some lightning bolt control, there'd be, right? But it's not me, but I'm thinking in my mind, that's a lightning bolt moment. That's a time I think God should be acting and showing his righteousness over that wickedness. And I'm left in confusion because they're back on the next day and the next week and the next month, and they're in their older years and they're still doing ungodly, wicked things. Where is God's restraint of wickedness? And we question that when we see the wicked living a long life. So, we don't see God's swift judgment. We often don't see his judgment at all here. For a Christian, we have an understanding ultimately things will be made equal somewhere else. But do Christians still deal with this issue here in this life? Do we still wonder why God allows wickedness to go on for so long and the wicked to not just go on, they prosper? It doesn't make sense. That's what Solomon's grappling with, and that's exactly why he had to give us verses 13 and 14 so we'd understand what it was he came to the conclusion of. God doesn't operate in the way we think he should. And now he's giving us some examples of that. In verse 16, because what one does in appearance does not change what God has planned for our eternal destination, what counsel does Solomon give? Don't overdo. He says, do not be excessively righteous and do not be overly wise. Okay, on its face value, ladies, does that make any sense at all? No. So we have to break it down. What does righteousness look like from God's standards? From God's standards, if we know what God's standards are, we'd say perfection. Right? Perfection is the only form of righteousness that God sees. Can any man be righteous from what he does by God's standards? Absolutely not. So it's my conclusion this is not talking about righteous standards from God's perspective. What does excessive righteousness look like from man's standards? Well, first, man establishes what he thinks is righteous. Correct? We call them checklists, do's and don'ts. All religions have them, and a lot of us walk around with those checklists in our own lives. So, first thing you have to do is you have to come up with what your list of righteousness would look like. Then a man goes about doing all the things they determined on their list of righteousness. And they hold on to them fervently. These are the things, and you need to do these things. So man, in his way, creates a checklist for himself. When man keeps his checklist, he sees himself as righteous. What do we call that? Self-righteous. I'm self-righteous, and that means on my checklist, I can meet my checklist. So I'm self-righteous, not God-righteous. So you see how that word, whose form of righteousness is Solomon talking about? He's talking about when man does that. So don't be excessive, he says. What do we see happen when men live this kind of a life? In just your experience, those check marks, those self-righteous people. Legalism. All caps. I didn't put them in all caps in my notes, but no, I was thinking about it. Legalism is what happens when you see self-righteousness gone amok. All right? Because let's just think about it for a second. If I've got my list, let's say I picked 10 because there was 10 commandments. I thought 10 was a good number. I made 10 things. So on my list of 10, if I'm keeping all those 10, and to me, those are the things that equal righteousness, well, don't I need to help you understand how my 10 are things you also should be doing? And you? You all should be following my checklist because it's righteousness. So I'm going to bring you into my form of righteousness, and when you meet those, then now I see you as righteous. That's excessive. That's me holding on to my list, and now it becomes your list. In Christianity, that's not how it works, because God has an independent relationship with each and every individual. So something he might have called me to do, maybe something with my gift or some situation he's put me into, does that mean that it's the same thing for you? Absolutely not. And just because he's put something on your heart that's for you, does it now mean that it bleeds over into my life and I have to do that thing? Absolutely not. So that's what Solomon's talking about with excessive righteousness. The checklist, the religious checklist. We think of it that way, but there's a whole lot of checklists outside of religion, ladies, that people live their lives by, and they've got their little list. At least at least I'm not Hitler, right? How many unbelievers will come up, well, at least I wasn't him. Somehow they're on a good checklist because they weren't him. They found somebody really bad, and at least they were the scale in the sky kind of thing. At least I'm not there. Don't be excessively righteous, and that means in your determination of righteousness. What else does he say? Advice to avoid, he says. He said, do not be overly wise. That was the next. So, could this refer to someone who thinks they are wise enough to figure out what pleases God in some external way, what that checklist must be and how to keep it, and they keep that checklist, then God will certainly respond in a particular way, won't he? If I keep my checklists, then God's going to do what I think God should do for me. That's him being wise. Yes? That's exactly right. That's us packaging God up and deciding what it is I need to do to please him. And then when I do that, he's supposed to do for me. Is that a form of bargaining with God? He doesn't work that way. But there are many that believe that he does. And that is what Solomon's warning against. If I do this or think that, God will certainly do X, Y, Z. And you can turn on your weekend sermons and you can hear men that will come right out and say, if you'll just think positive thoughts, this will be what happens. Or if you'll just, I don't know, give me some money so I can plant it for you, and then there'll be these wonderful blessings, right? I mean, this thinking starts somewhere small, and it started a long time ago in the American, or what we call the Western church, but it has flourished into a monster of a mountain with all kinds of teachings. But at its core, this is what it's teaching. Think a certain way and be a certain way before God, and God will absolutely, in fact, have to do these things for you. I've heard those words. God is bound now. He has to do these things for you. That's what Solomon's talking about. Don't be excessively righteous. Don't be coming up with your own checklist. And don't think that now you can be wise and tell God how he's supposed to respond. Isn't that what Solomon's been dealing with back from verses 13 and 14? Man wants to be able to predict what God should do. And in so doing, one of the things he does is he makes his righteous checklist, and then he expects God to respond based on what he did on his righteous checklist. And God's not going to be found that way.
So is that putting God in debt to?
Right. Not putting God in debt to us. Right? It's just, it seems silly to us, right, when you take it to its extension, but it's not how it appears when these guys are up there, leading people along the way. And they go to the most ridiculous verses to prove some point, and this is their conclusion. Oh, but we know if you do this, God's going to promise you that. And if you do this, God has to do this. He can't do any different. Oh, my goodness. They're defining God. And Solomon says, that's not how it works. In all my lifetime and all the things I've seen, that's not how it works. What does it mean for one to ruin themselves? Or what does he say? To destroy oneself. He says ruin, but what would you say that? I mean, I can say I had a bad hair day. I ruined my hair, right? There's a difference between that and what he's talking about. So by ruin, what does he mean? To not achieve the very thing that one thought that they were building. Only God can determine righteousness. God does not reward men for their self-determined righteousness. When one does their own righteousness, they are not looking for true righteousness from God. If I've got my checklist, I don't really need to be checking in with him. And in that way, I can destroy myself. I'm pretty much good enough. If I'm good enough, I don't need a Savior. I don't need a God, except the God that fits into my package deal. Verse 17. What else does Solomon warn against doing? Well, that seems obvious. Except we need to go along the same thing and understand it in terms of what he's just talked about with the righteousness, right? So what is excessive wickedness? To do the things that one knows is against, we would say, maybe God's standards or moral standards. But what does this require one to do? Don't I need to make a checklist of the things that would be seen as wicked? It's another checklist form. It's wickedness on display. Wait a minute, but who decided what was wicked? Right? Don't be excessively in that wickedness. Now, generically, is that a true statement that Solomon made that we could apply in any way whatsoever in any culture or time? Yeah, don't be wicked. Don't do it excessively. Well, why does he have to say excessively? Why wouldn't he just say, well, just don't be wicked? Because man has this pie in the sky. Well, there's some wicked, because we're all kind of wicked. But just don't really go out there. That's the bad one you want to avoid, right? It's like, no, that's not the way God sees it. That's the way man can see it. What else is he to avoid in that verse 17? Do not be a fool. Again, we probably don't have a true understanding of that because we use that term very casually. You know, kids act foolishly or whatever. We just throw that term around. But the scriptures gave us a very specific definition of that. Back in Psalms 14:1, I'm just going to read the first verse here. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That's the fool that Solomon's talking about. Somebody who's off the rail, wickedness abounds, and in their heart they say, there is no God. So Solomon says a person should not be a fool in his heart and say there is no God. When one says there is no God, he will act excessively wicked. That is the conclusion. Those are the two things that go hand in hand. Verse 17, what should be on the mind of someone who says there is no God and is excessively wicked? What is the question he goes in that verse next with? He says, why should you die before your time? Well, that opens up a whole bit of teaching we need to get into. What does it imply that one can die before their time? It could be spiritual death before us, but spiritual death would be from the beginning to the end. It just means he was never given any spiritual life. Okay, we know, and we'll get into that God's appointed a time, but from this perspective, if I say at a funeral, oh, poor Suzanne, she went before her time, what am I assuming? She should have had some more time. Isn't that what I'm assuming? If I say someone's died before their time, I'm assuming they should have had some more time. So we've established this standard in our mind for what that would be. And yet we know who determines when our time to die is. God. Solomon's already been through that with us back in chapter 3. Remember, chapter 3, verse 1? There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. So from God's standards, that's already been established. God has determined the day of our life and death. We do not change God's mind about this day. From what perspective has Solomon been speaking in terms of determining righteousness and wickedness? Man's perspective. So why would a man incite God to destroy him before his time? What perspective then is being described when he says, why should you die before your time? He's looking for man's perspective. You can't go longer than God has determined. But if you're going to be blatantly out there wicked, are you trying to challenge God? Again, if you have the mentality of the scale in the sky, enough wickedness, maybe I'll just get out of here early. In their hearts, men can think that way. In verse 18, what is Solomon's advice? It's good that you grasp one thing and also not let go of the other. Okay, here we go, ladies. Solomon says that he has presented two things to be grasped. What are they? That man-determined self-righteousness is ruin. Would you agree with that's one of the things that he put out there for us? Man finding his own way or his own path to God does not exist. There are some men who then declare, if I can't get to God my way, then I will deny there is a God. Men must remember not to practice either of these things in his life. Because both of these things are true. Both of the things that Solomon just revealed to us are true things to keep in mind. They are not either or. So it's not like you're good if you grab the first one with the self-righteous thought, or you went the other extreme and didn't have any God belief. Like, I can't control God, so I'm just not going to believe in him. He's saying both of these things are still true. You don't get to do the excessive wickedness and pretend there's no God, but you also don't get to come along and create your own version of righteousness. Hold on to both of these. Don't let either of these go, because both of these are true. How easy is it for those that have created their own self-righteousness to at least say, well, I'm not as bad as the guy that has no God and is wicked. Solomon's saying, no, guess what? You're both in the same boat. Your excessive righteousness didn't make you any better than the guy who was denying God and wicked his entire life. They are equal in God's eyes. Hold on to them in that regard. Not do them. Does he turn around and then say, well, I think you should go out and you should do excessive wickedness and you should be excessive? Is he saying that? No, he's saying you hold on to both of those at the same time. Don't trade one off for the other. They're both going to end up in ruin. That's what he's concluding with. If it were me, ladies, I would have written that completely different than Solomon did. Can I just say? Oh my goodness. But if you unpack it and you understand, right, what he was talking about back in verses 13 and 14, then you can understand. Excessive righteousness, human standards. Denying God, human standards. Wickedness, right? And in human standards, don't forget, you don't get to pick one of these. Neither of them ends up in righteousness. All right. In verse 18, what is also true for the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. Who is the one who fears God? A believer. A believer then comes forth with both of them. Both of what? Not a standard of self-righteousness and not denying God. A believer comes forth with both of those elements. I'm not going to give my self-righteous list and I'm not going to deny God. A believer can embrace both. When does the believer turn to, who does the believer turn to in determining the proper standards of righteousness, and who ultimately determines how those standards will be met? God. Yeah, it's like Sunday school. If it's not God, then the second choice is Jesus, and then you're pretty good of having the right answer. I haven't done that as much in Ecclesiastes. I'm going to do it a little bit today. It's just because you can't always go into the New Testament. You can't always go, well, we know this is different now because blah, blah, blah. But I am going to go there on this one. So we're going to go to Romans chapter 4. And we're going to do verses 1 through 8. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Righteousness. Now, to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but as what's due. And I wish we had a whole half hour just to do this passage, but we're not going to do that. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Do you see the definition there? Righteousness can't be earned. There is no checklist for righteousness. They knew that even in regards to Abraham. Just as David also speaks of the blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. So in Romans, you have quotations from the Old Testament. The one in speaking of Abraham can be found in Genesis 15:6. So in Solomon's day, they would have at least had the scriptures of the Old Testament, the teachings from Moses. Righteousness had already been told to them. It doesn't come from works. It's credited by God. So that, at its very core, would have been understood. The second part of Romans is quoted out of Psalms. Was Psalms in existence in Solomon's time? Especially at the end of his life, right? Because we figured David did a lot of it, and there's even thought that Solomon contributed. It would have been fresh stuff. All right? He knew what it said. He understood. Righteousness is determined by God. It's not by your works. What do you think he's spinning out about? That's really, really difficult. So not only was it difficult because God's got y'all confused that he doesn't do good when there's good for your eternity and he doesn't do bad when there's not. Now he's embracing the fact that, oh yeah, and man, you don't get to make your own rules either. To try to get there, to try to force God's hand in your own self-righteousness. Neither of them equals righteousness. You don't get to figure out what God's doing, and you don't get to try to control God. And so we spin out on that. I spin out on that. This man is spinning out on that at the end of his life, and he's been trying to figure it out for a long time. Let's do Ecclesiastes 7, verses 19 through 23. Wisdom strengthens a wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins. Also, do not take seriously all words which are spoken, so that you will not hear your servant cursing you. For you also have realized that you likewise have many times cursed others. I tested all this with wisdom and said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Okay, let's go back to verse 19. When a man turns to God to understand righteousness, what happens? Wisdom strengthens a wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. This specific wisdom of turning to God for righteousness strengthens a wise man. What is this wisdom compared to? 10 rulers are in a city. Did I skip too far in that estimation of what that verse says? Wisdom strengthens a wise man. What wisdom had he just been declaring? The wisdom of understanding self-righteousness and denial of God are not the ways to God. Wisdom strengthens a wise man. Then he throws out this very weird thing about 10 rulers who are in a city. All right, so we're going to talk about the number 10. In scriptures, 10, and when you see the number 10 given, what does it mean? For those who've been in my study of Esther and Ruth, you probably have a little heads up on this because we spent more time there then than I'll be able to give it now. The number 10 is a representation of a testimony or a witness. It's a testimony or a witness. Quickly, if you've done Esther, there was the time when the 10 sons of Haman were hanged, and it demonstrated the destruction of the enemies of God's people. So Haman and his 10 sons, their 10 hanging up there. That was a picture of God's witness and testimony about what happens to the enemies of Israel. We've got the 10 Commandments, because everybody knows about the 10 Commandments. Even when they don't read the Bible, people know there's 10 Commandments. But the 10 Commandments, are those the only rules you got to follow? No. It's a testimony or a witness to man's inability to find standards of righteousness. Just in those 10, men fail. They were just a symbol, right? They were a testimony and a witness to righteousness, only in that God was demonstrating man can't keep it on his own. In the book of Ruth, and we're going to go there because 10 men are specifically talked about. In the book of Ruth, we find that in the book of Ruth, it demonstrates this practice within cities to have 10 men present when conducting legally substantial business within a city. So in Ruth, chapter 4, I'm just going to read verses 1 and 2. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down. He, Boaz, took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. When there are 10 men as elders in a city, there is a protection over this city from corruption. This was wisdom that had been passed down from Moses. This was a number to represent protection, a witness, and a testimony. It's much easier for me to bribe one judge and get by with it than 10. It's about impossible to do that. So when 10 elders were brought into the gate of a city, they oversaw all the legal proceedings, every form of judgment that would come before them, to make sure the law was enforced and that bribery and corruption would not happen within that city. This apparently was something Solomon knew, because he talks about it being a pretty good thing. He says understanding this wisdom from God is even better for man than understanding 10 men in a city. Does that make a little sense now to you, in a way that when you first read it in Ecclesiastes makes absolutely no sense? Made no sense, right? But when you see the number 10, you have to understand it's a testimony and a witness of something. And there's all kinds of references to the number 10 throughout the scriptures, and we could do a whole bunch of teaching on that as well. So I'm just asking you to trust me that 10 represents witness and testimony when you see it in Scripture. And because Solomon is specifically referring to 10 men in a city, we go to the other place in Scripture where 10 men in the city were referred to. But you do have to know a little bit about that story. Boaz is taking something of a legal consideration before the 10, so that when this, was he called there? He was called the close relative, comes forward, there's a witness and a testimony that he can't back out of. That's Boaz's purpose. They're a witness and a testimony to stand for the truth. In this case, the righteousness that will prevail for Ruth. Okay? That's a little side note. I had somebody asking if I want to teach Ruth again. I'm like, I like Ruth. I like Ruth a lot. We might go there. Okay. Verse 20. Why is this true? The truth being that the wisdom Solomon just gave to somebody that would read this was better than the 10 men. In verse 20, why is that true? We don't spend a lot of time here, right? We all kind of get that one. Solomon says there is not a single man on earth who never sins. No argument there. Don't have to peel that one away. When a man is called righteous, that is not to be confused with sinless. Okay? He's been talking about righteous, and now he's like, well, I just want to make it clear. When I say righteous, I'm not talking about somebody who's sinless. So he's even kind of uncovering that here for himself. Righteousness defined by God is all that we need to look at. I'm going to go back to Psalms 14, 1 through 3, because we read the first verse. But I just want to continue it so that you will understand that Solomon is aware of these teachings, of these words. Because he'd already talked about verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And he's already talked about how to avoid being a fool. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good. Not even one. Did ancient man understand that no one was perfect? It wasn't a new concept for Christians in the New Testament, okay? It was a complete understanding. Man, none of them did good before God. This verse makes it clear that there is no one who can do good before God, not one. So when we see the term righteousness being used, we are not to confuse it with the term of godly righteous or perfection. Ecclesiastes 7:21, then, what other warning does Solomon give? Do not take seriously all words which are spoken. Okay, well, where are we going to go with that one? What specific words is Solomon warning against listening to in the continuation of that verse? So that you will not hear your servant cursing you. Why would a servant be cursing a master? Because obviously this is spoken from the master's perspective, or you wouldn't be referring to it as a servant. So it's not servants sitting next to servants. It's the master hearing the servant curse him. Why would an employee curse their employer? Because that's kind of the closest thing we have now. They have a perspective they've been treated unfairly. That's exactly why they would curse their master. When a master does not respond the way a servant expects, that does not mean that the master gives attention to what the servant might be saying. Is that a picture of something Solomon's trying to come to grasp with here? In the same way, when God does not respond the way men believe he should respond, God does not listen to men. He is not swayed the same way a servant will not sway his master. This is how we should approach God. Does that make sense? Solomon's like, don't listen to the words that are spoken. All these things he's just revealed to us, that he's walking along and he's talking about wisdom. He said, for those who don't agree with this, those who have other words to put out there, don't listen to them, just like a master shouldn't be listening to his servant because he might overhear him cursing. In the big picture, does that really matter? It's because Solomon wants to display the heart issue that would be in operation of the servant as he's cursing the master, and that the master would happen to overhear. Does he tell what the master to go do? He says, just ignore the words. Just like God's going to ignore the words. He's not going to be persuaded by man. When man comes and says, well, you should do this for me, or if you don't, you're not really God. Okay, well, there you go. Right? It's not changing God's role as God. It's changing the person who's having the attitude that day. Or in some cases, that lifetime. Verse 22. When a master does not hear his servant cursing him, what is he to remember? For you also have realized that you likewise have many times cursed others. So the one who has heard the cursing of one about himself also cursed others. There is no one who has not cursed others. Solomon's basically saying, we all have a tendency to do this very thing, to be upset at some point and to say something against God, right? And you have to be careful how far you go with that, but the bottom line is it doesn't make any difference who speaks. Their words are not to be listened to. When men will accuse others, and often don't you find this to be true, what man will accuse others of doing, isn't that often what you find in their background? When men have come around and they've been living awful, but now they've come up with their self-righteous checklist, Boy, won't they go after others who aren't going to adopt their self-righteous checklist more so than anybody else? When they do this before God, their words need to be ignored. Men have declared they do not believe there's a God, and these words need to be ignored. All the words that represent anything that Solomon's been talking about, he's like, don't even give it the time of day. Those words are to be ignored. In verse 23, what did Solomon say he had done in regard to these standards? He said, I tested all this with wisdom. Remember, the man with the greatest wisdom and discernment ever. What is the this that Solomon tried to test? Where would you have to go back to? God not responding to the way Solomon believed that God should respond. It's the thing he's been spinning out about. It's the thing mankind spins out about when God doesn't respond the way we think he should respond. This would mean both to men who declared their self-righteousness before God as well as those who deny or in denial that there is a God. This may include those who were righteous yet not receiving what Solomon thought should be the reward. How did Solomon test these words? With his wisdom. What did Solomon say he tried to be in this regard? But it was far from him. So Solomon dedicated himself to be wise in this estimation or understanding of God's judgment of men here on earth. What was the conclusion of this for Solomon? It was far from me. Solomon was unable to determine by his standard of wisdom what God was doing when he responded to men. Let that one sink in. So back in verses 13 and 14, we find the conclusion, and then we have to go to these verses for Solomon to say, I just kept trying to figure it out in my wisdom, and I couldn't figure it out. It's far from me. I can't identify it. Remember how it's hard for us to grasp that. And I don't know about you, but I don't see myself as particularly wise or discerning, not compared to all the things of the whole entire earth. He was way up there, higher than any other man was ever going to be, and he couldn't figure it out. Don't you think he was on the verge of what we might say is madness? He couldn't find the answer. He thought somehow there has to be a way. There's some way I'm not putting this puzzle together right. And if I just keep trying, I'll get this puzzle. I will figure it out. And he goes through his whole life and he's not figuring it out. But he's going to take us somewhere interesting next in this journey that he made to try to figure this out. So we're going to read Ecclesiastes 7 verses 24 through 29. You didn't think I'd get here, did you? I am moving. What has been is remote and exceedingly mysterious. Who can discover it? I directed my mind to know, to investigate, and to seek wisdom and an explanation, and to know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. All right, did we get it right where he was going so far? And I discovered, more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. One who is pleasing to God will escape from her, but the sinner will be captured by her. Behold, I have discovered this, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find an explanation, which I am still seeking but have not found. I have found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these. Behold, I have found only this, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices. Right? Doesn't that just make so much sense? Like, where are we going to go now? All right, we are going to take this tornado and we're going to unpack the winds, because that's what it feels like to me as I was reading this. What? 1,000 and there's no women, and what the heck is Solomon talking about? Keeping it in context is key. Verse 24. What is Solomon's denouncement? What has been is remote and is exceedingly mysterious. What is meant by what has been? That which God has already done. The explanation of what God had already done is described, is remote and exceedingly mysterious. What is remote? It's if somebody's a remote island, right? It's far off. It's separated. I can't possibly think about getting there. It's different in different cultures, because I can tell you the word remote meant in my house the thing on the television set that you had to go get to change your TV, okay? It was not that remote. Sometimes we have to define those words. What is exceedingly mysterious? Well, I turned to my favorite dictionary.com. It's of obscure nature or meaning or origin, puzzling, inexplicable. So exceedingly mysterious. You just can't figure it out. How many times do we keep coming back to this? This is what he was spinning out about in his life. He couldn't figure it out. It was far from him. What God had done wasn't making sense to him. God's response were far off from how men would respond. Their meaning is lost on men, and their reasoning is lost on men. Even Solomon. Because that's how amazing God is. He is not going to be figured out. Man does not have an ability to understand what he sees here on earth in this lifetime in measurable outcomes. God's ways are not man's ways. In verse 24, what is Solomon's rhetorical question? Who can discover it? What man can actually discover the measurements of how God works? We even get a little clue of that, right, in the New Testament. Paul's kind of dealing with that. In Romans 11:33, he says, "Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways." See, Paul just says it so clearly. I don't know why Solomon didn't have that. Like, there, look, Paul said it nicely. I'm going to put that in my notes. But there's a reason. I don't know if it's just because he was so intelligent, he just was spinning out or what. But he's basically saying the same thing. What's been done, what God did, I can't figure it out. It's far off from me. It's isolated. It's mysterious. That's what he keeps saying. Paul says it too, but I just like the way Paul says it better. All right, Ecclesiastes 7, verse 25. What did Solomon say that his desire was? He said, I directed my mind to know, to investigate, to seek wisdom and an explanation. Could it be more clear now what he's continually been telling us as he's unfolding? He's looking for an answer. Solomon truly wanted an answer to his questions in this regard, to know. He used all the knowledge of his mind, his reasoning, and all his abilities to research or investigate to find the answer to his questions. Solomon desired an answer established in wisdom that would be an explanation to what God secures. What was the answer in the forefront of Solomon's mind? Or I'm sorry, what was the question in the forefront of Solomon's mind? And to know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. Okay, so the trail of folly will lead to evil, the trail of foolishness leads to madness. I'd say he already discovered the second one, if you ask me. Solomon's desire to know the end result of folly and foolishness. This was his quest. This is what he wanted an answer for. Which ties back up to, if we could just figure out by what God was doing, I would have been able to come to a conclusion, right? I would have always seen that folly came to this end, and I would exactly know how God thinks and how God rewards and how God works. God didn't give him that answer. So he's spinning out. In verse 26, what example does Solomon say he experienced? This is the easy one, right, ladies? And I discovered more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. Okay. Solomon knew death could be bitter, but what did he determine to be more bitter than death? The woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. Well, let's think about this. Is there an example in the scriptures of a woman who represented this in Solomon's life? 3 verses. We've read some of this, but it just helps to go back and to have some of those things highlighted. Actually, there'll be a couple more verses. It's 1 Kings 9, 16 and 17. We'll start there. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer and the lower Beth-horon. Don't understand how a burnt-out city makes a good dowry? Well, it doesn't make sense to me. I didn't live in the culture, but somehow this property, this city, all the evil men or men that would have stood against Egypt and maybe Solomon are removed, it becomes a dowry for this wife. I'm not trying to explain it. I'm just saying that's what the scriptures say that was given to her as a dowry. 1 Kings 7, verse 7 and 8. So this was back when there's the list of the things that Solomon had built. He made the hall of the throne where he was to judge, the hall of judgment, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to floor. His house where he was to live, the outer court inward from the hall, was in the same workmanship. He also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom Solomon had married. Something about decorating a house that's got paneling from the top to the bottom, which was the throne room in the temple, and Solomon built something like that in his house. He also built this woman's house to reflect. I don't know if there's an underlying thought of judgment taking place there. I don't know. Just saying, I find it interesting that he specifically tells us that he built her house in that way. 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 11. Then Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house which he had built for her. And he said, "My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy where the ark of the Lord had rested." Don't you find that interesting? From these scriptures, it is clear Solomon entered marriage with Pharaoh's daughter. She is not named for us in scriptures. He honored her with a great house. He describes what it looked like. Pretty fancy. Solomon, however, knew this wife was not a follower of God, and he did not allow her to dwell in the house of the king because it was holy and she was not. We don't know all the reasons to know that she's not. We just know in the conclusion, he knew she shouldn't reside in the house that was holy. So something about this woman is particularly identifiable to him as somebody that shouldn't be living in this house. We don't go into all the details, and maybe we don't need to. What was one outcome Solomon says was possible in regards to this woman? So back in Ecclesiastes, what did he say? When it goes on, he says, one who's pleasing to God will escape her. Who is the one who is pleasing to God? One who's following God's ways would be pleasing to God. So the one who follows God's ways would escape this woman. I'm just going to stretch a little here and say maybe it would appear at some point in Solomon's life he'd escaped some evil of this woman by not allowing her to dwell in the house of David of Israel. When he was wise in his ways before God, he removed her. What else is described in Ecclesiastes? Oh, but the sinner, what happens to the sinner? Will be captured by her. Which outcome do we see Solomon experienced in his life, later in his life? We've been here before, right? 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. Now it came about when Solomon finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house, which you have built, by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. As for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded, you will keep my statutes and my ordinances. Then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, then which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name, and I will cast out of my sight. So Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples, and this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will be astonished and hiss and say, why has the Lord done this in the land? And they will say, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and adopted other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this adversity on them. That's the setup. God tells him what he's going to do before it happens. When Israel doesn't do this, when this happens, this is going to be what I do. 1 Kings 11, starting in verse 1 through 13. Again, we've read this before, we've studied it before, but it's relevant here, so I'm reading it again. I might be going a little fast. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. Notice how she is singled out? Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them. Not just not marry, don't even associate with them. Nor shall they associate with you. For they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father. Solomon, the most wise, discerning man, did these things. Then Solomon built a high place for Sheremoth, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol, the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my commandment and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Who was Solomon captured by? In 1 Kings 11, verse 4. What highlight do we find there? His wives turned his heart away after other gods. There is one wife that is called out specifically, and who was that? Pharaoh's daughter. The question is, why did Solomon turn his heart away after other gods? What is Solomon looking for? He wants an answer to his question.
He's writing about himself here.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we'll get the clue as to why we know it's him specifically he's talking about in those next verses. But my question to you, we read that, right? Oh yeah, Solomon, he chased after, these other gods, and he loved his wives, and he did that. This is a man of most incredible discernment and wisdom. Why? I contend it's because Solomon is right here in Ecclesiastes telling us why. In Ecclesiastes, he says, I wanted an answer. And it was far from me. It was remote. It was exceedingly mysterious. This God wouldn't give me an answer. So you know where I'm going to go? I'm going to go finding it in another place. Maybe one of these women has an answer in the gods that they worship. And that's exactly what the rest of this chapter tells us that he did. Verse 27, how does Solomon answer what he was looking for? He said, behold, I've discovered this. Again, when it says the preacher, it's referring back to the interpretation of the word that back at the beginning in chapter 1 was koheleth. So it's the same person speaking that was at the beginning. Adding one thing to another to find an explanation. What one thing was Solomon adding to another in these scriptures? I'm adding, a wife, but what came with the wife? Another God. One after the other, Solomon continues to add, looking for an answer. He's looking for an answer. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 5. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idols of the Ammonites. And in verse 7 we found, and Solomon built a high place for Sheremoth. He didn't just go somewhere on a trip on vacation with Myrtle and they happened upon the idol of Cheremosh, right? He built it right there for her. And he participated with her. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed before their gods. And we talked in an earlier lesson about exactly what that meant. Exactly how detestable the worship before these were. We talked about the infant sacrifices. We've talked about all of the evilness that's there. So in verse 27, what was Solomon seeking? To find an explanation. An explanation to what question? What was the last question that he gave us in Ecclesiastes that he was looking an explanation for? Back in verse 25, what is the question that he's looking for? To know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. In verse 28, what does Solomon say about finding an explanation to his question? I'm seeking, but I haven't found. We know where he went seeking. If we read the scripts, what the scriptures tell us about him, we can see exactly where he went to seek. Solomon had not found the answer to his question in all the places he sought to find his answer in seeking after the other gods of his wives. What did Solomon find? I found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among these. Okay, what? This is where I would say you look to the scriptures and you find out, like we did before when we talked the second lad, when we were in chapter 2, and we referenced that, and like, oh, well, he was the second lad to be king, right? We had to go into the story that was revealed and find out how he became finally crowned the king. Same thing here. In the scriptures that we just read in 1 Kings 11:3, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. How many does 700 and 300 make? Solomon had a total of 1,000 women who were either considered his wife or a princess, meaning in marriage to him, or a concubine. What single man would have been found among these 1,000? One man is found among the 1,000. Himself. He found himself among these 1,000 women. Oh, we're not there yet. You're making some assumptions. Stay tuned. That's right. Come back next week. I'll have an answer. No, I'm not. What was this one man seeking? An answer to his questions. What else does Solomon say he did not find? A woman among... Okay, well, wait a minute. First of all, there were all women in this 1,000. All right, so that's not what he's saying. Solomon is saying there was not a woman found among these 1,000 women who were seeking what? The explanation to his questions. He's the only man among the 1,000 he's seeking. There's not one of them in all the worship of all their gods and all that he participated in with them who were seeking for that answer or who found that answer. Verse 29, what conclusion could Solomon then make? I have found only this. So he didn't find what he really wanted to find, but I have found only this, that God made men upright. So what can God do? Make men upright. What does man do? Seek out many devices. Man seeks out devices to be what? Upright. That ties into what he was talking about earlier in the self-righteousness. This is futility, as only God can make man upright. The 1,000 women, if it wasn't declared for us in the other scriptures to be able to look at that, let's say, wait a minute, we're talking about Solomon, and we're talking about 1,000 women, and these verses are talking about 1,000. Should I go there to look for some of my answers? I'd say yes. There's nowhere else of anybody else that's declared to have 1,000 wives, but scriptures, for whatever reason, clearly defined the exact number. Don't you find that interesting? There wasn't 1,001, and there wasn't 999. He had 1,000. And now, in Ecclesiastes, in these verses, we find him talking about those 1,000. What else could that mean? Trust me, ladies. What else could that mean? On its own, it makes no sense. Just flying out there, right? Well, there's one man in 1,000 and there's not any women at all. What? What does that mean? That doesn't make sense in any other thing. One commentary, I'll just mention it, talked about women or woman here was talking about folly. So it's the folly that becomes the woman in what Ecclesiastes is talking about, and then she should be avoided, and was like, well, that makes no sense because he says, I couldn't find that I'm seeking for answers. I'm looking for an explanation. He's an incredibly intelligent man. And he tells us over and over, I couldn't find it. I never found it. I'm filled with madness because I can't get an explanation. I went looking for one after the other way to find the answer. Guess what? There was no answer. And he's spinning out. He cannot find the answer. He's willing to do anything. He was willing to build places for idol worship and child sacrifice and everything else unimaginable to get an answer to this question. Why? Because God wouldn't answer the question the way he wanted. Man turns to all kinds of places when we can't get the answer that we think God, a good God, right? Again, we define it for the rest of the world. Well, if it was a good God, he would, or he wouldn't. And God said, that's not the way you get to know me. Self-righteousness isn't the way. Deny me, I'm not going to do you any good. It's ruin. It's to break us. And instead of Solomon being broken before God and admitting that in my wisdom and discernment, I'm not going to come up with the answer to this, I just have to trust. He knew enough to say, I know that God has a reason. I want to figure it out. And he did everything. I mean, how many years of his life did he spend building and marrying 1,000 women and doing all that it takes to build up the cities and do the worship? And that's his life. He spent his life. But he tells us at the end here, I was seeking an answer. Doesn't that, I'm sorry, ladies, does that not make a little more sense on why there's 1,000 wives? Because there is no other explanation. There was a reason. It's not just because he needed to have something physical. I mean, he's got after 900, I mean, that's not what he's looking for. So he had to be searching after something. He wanted an answer to this question. And each one of these had something he thought, maybe in that I'll find the answer. And God in his wisdom said, nope, you're not going to find me your way. But Solomon is just spinning out because he wants an answer to that question. Do we want an answer to that question? At the end of today, or in a month, or whenever there's an answer to what's going on in our country, are we going to want an answer today? But we're not going to go before God and demand. We're going to know God is sovereign. He has a plan. I am part of that plan. I am watching what he does, and I'm going to do my part in his sovereign will, and I'm going to be content. Can you be content in your heart no matter what you see going all around you? Again, it's easy when everything's great and prosperity abounds, but when there's adversity, we struggle. And Solomon wanted that firm answer, and God said, that's not the way. You might not understand what any conclusion of anything is today, tomorrow, or next week. You don't have to. Don't hang on to that as your ultimate goal of deciding just how faithful you can be in following this God. He is God. He has measurements of righteousness and how to make you upright, and that's what you need. As Romans said, that's where you go. The faithful are determined in righteousness before God, in their faith. We let go of trying to earn it in any way, shape, or form. You can't get there. This was hard. But if this is what Solomon's teaching, is this not absolutely appropriate for every Christian to understand? Always, but in particular, maybe potentially right now? Don't spin up in what goes on around the world. You can sit back and know, my God, who I can't possibly explain to you in completeness, is in charge. And by the way, would you like this kind of contentment? Because the world around you, ladies, is going to be up in arms no matter what. But they already are, right? Are there not communications that you're already having when everybody is just spun up? Be the witness before God of a woman that has an absolutely calm, contented heart who knows exactly who God is and that she doesn't have to explain him to anybody. And in your calmness and in that, they'll be drawn to want to know what you know about God. That's a witness and a testimony. And that's what we're called to do. Be content in all circumstances because you know you can't explain all the things about God and you don't have to. But you can explain one thing, and that is when you become a believer in Jesus Christ as your Savior, when you have the Holy Spirit in you, you are different than the rest of the world. You have an eternal promise and guarantee on you that can bring you contentment when the world is in chaos. That's the answer that you have. Live that life. Ladies, this is exciting times we live in. You get to be a witness to who knows how many people in a world that is actually looking for answers, just like Solomon. And they're looking for it in all kinds of crazy places. But you have the answer, and you know where to go, and you be content. And they'll want that.